Like, share, subscribe, click the notification bell, and on with the video. Alright, welcome back to the SHTF garden, and we're going through extending your PowerStation's cycle life. So we're going to get right to it. It's somewhat of dry material, but if you are in a Mad Max type situation, or you are wanting to protect your investment, then obviously you want to be able to make it last as long as possible. We got three basic chemistries that we're going into: NMC, lithium iron phosphate, and lithium batteries, which is like 18650 cells. So let's roll with it. Alright, so there's going to be some assumptions made to be able to try and figure out how this is going to work. So first off, we're assuming the chart I'm going to show is accurate. We're going to assume that the PowerStation's battery meter is accurate. As if it's 10%, it's really 10%, 90%, it's really 90%. This also, the battery life charging abilities will be affected by temperature, and so if you do like really rapid charging, you leave an extreme temperature, it's really hot, really cold, it will also lower your battery life expectations. So this is just excluding any of that. I'm going to be making some assumptions, and I'll show you why and how, about the total battery capacity based on the chart. And of course, so the manufacturer's information needs to be accurate for that to be accurate. Alright, so the chart's going to be coming from batteryuniversity.com. I got the article right there if you want to pause and go check this stuff out for yourself. Battery University. Alright, so NMC, we are using as our example a EcoFlow Mini. Alright, 882 watt hours of capacity. That's the rated capacity for this machine. And we got NMC, lithium iron phosphate. So if we wanted to try and increase these the battery life of this particular one or any other NMC, we'll use this as an example. We'll reference this chart. If you did 100% depth of discharge, that's DOD is depth of discharge, you went from 100% of every single watt that battery could hold down to zero for a full discharge. You would only get about 300 cycle lives of NMC. Now, so of course, why was that important? Because this thing is rated to 882 watts. Or at 882 watts, it's rated for 800 cycles, which means they're not using every single iota of power that you can get. They're using more like 50%. Alright, so the assumption is that the BMS is allowing for a 50% depth of discharge, and that's how you get your 800 cycles. So the total of battery capacity is actually 1,764 watt hours in the Delta Mini, if that assumption is correct. So if our goal is to say we want to try and extend the life of the Delta Mini to 4,000 cycles, and we only cycle it hard during emergencies. So you're in Florida, you see the hurricanes coming, and there was a tropical storm coming towards North Carolina now. You want to take off the restrictions, use it to max power because you know you're going to need it. But if you're just recharging your phone or something like that, day-to-day use, that you want to restrict that power usage so that you can get the most cycle life out of it. So if we wanted to try and extend it to 4,000 cycles, we're going to need a 15% depth of discharge. So showing here in the chart, about 15% will give you somewhere around 4,000 cycles. So here's the math on it. You got your 1764 times 15% is 264.6 watt hours divided by the 882 watt hours it's rated for, or 30% of the scale. I guess it doesn't really matter if how much you're going to go to the weeds with it, but this scale, 882, is not the full scale of the actual capacity of the battery. That is a scaled amount. So that's why this is 30% of the scale. So if you went 65 to 35%, if you set your max charge rate at 65% and you never let it discharge below 35%, you'd only be using that sliver of power, you would get about 4,000 cycles of battery life per Battery University's chart. So that would be an incredible amount of power, but that's not necessarily realistic because you're only using a little bit. So let's say you're happy with 2,000 cycles. That might be a bit more realistic. So if you want 2,000 cycles, because that's 5.47 years if you cycle it every single day. So your depth of discharge at 2,000 to get 2,000 cycles is about 20%. So you take your 20% of your 1764, and that's 352.8. 352.8 divided by your 882 watts for your scale is 40% of our scale. So basically, if you charge and discharged, and I know Delta has an app, or the EcoFlow rather has an app that you can use to set your discharge rates. So, which is great. I wish all the power stations had that, or at least a power save button or battery saver button. But we'll come to that towards the end. So if you keep it within 70-30, then you would get about 2,000 cycles out of your in this particular case, out of your NMC battery power station. In this case, this example is a Delta Mini. All right, so this is a 18650. I actually have this one. That's why I use this as an example. It uses 18650 cells, lithium cells. It's rated at 1,000 cycles, and it's 607 watt hours. So it's not bad. It's got aluminum case and that kind of stuff. So why would you want maybe as an alternative for something like this? So we're going to go over what you could do with this. All right, so here's your example, 607 watt hours. It's an odd number to have, though. So why do we have that? We're going to look at the chart and find out. So with lithium cells, like tomorrow, 18650 cells, it's a little bit different because you're going by cell voltage. So you got 4.2 cell voltage is the max voltage those 18650s go to, and then you get 3 to 500. So that one is actually rated at 1,000 cycles. So it's probably more like 85% because the BMS is chopping off 15% of the battery to give you this, and it's only charging to 4.1 volts per cell. So let's take a look at that. So in this example, power stations rated 1,000. It leads me to believe, based on this chart, my assumption is going to be they're using 85% of the power because of this chart here. And if you do the math, 700 it'd be 715 watt hours at maximum rate. You got 85% of that gives you 607 watt hours, and that's kind of validates my assumptions. All right, so if we want to extend the battery life of that power station, then, or anyone that uses 18650 cells that's rated for 1,000 cycles, and you wanted to get it to 4,000 cycles, then you want to keep your depth of discharge about 60%. That would give you 429 watt hours usable, because 60% of your battery discharge. So if you kept it within 70 and 30% on this, or on there, you would get about, and 3.9 volts per cell, which you wouldn't be worried about that. That's just for information. You would get, somewhere in the neighborhood of the 4,000 range. So if you want to say 2,000 cycles, that might be a bit more realistic for your lithium 18650 cell based power station. You would keep it depth of discharge about 70% or so. So that would give you about 500 watt hours, and that would put you at about 82.4. So basically, you're looking at 92 to 9%. To make it easy, do a 90 to 10. You don't charge it above 90%. You don't discharge it below 10%. You get 80% of the power that it's rated for. In this case, 500 watts. But you are doubling the lifespan, or if it's you'd have to readjust the math and the percentages if you had a power station that only was rated for 500 cycles. But you could still apply the same principles to that. All right, so why is this important? Okay, so I just want to pause for a second and talk about why that's important, because my next example is going to be a Bluetti EB3A, which I have also, and it's rated to 2,500 cycles. So, which is really good. So you don't necessarily need to do much to extend the battery life of lithium iron phosphates, although you can, and then in the same way, and we're going to cover that. But those are much more expensive power stations versus it's probably all made in China, but for example, the Chinese knockoffs like the one I just showed you. So if you didn't want to spend the money on lithium iron phosphate and you were okay with a lithium battery, lithium 18650 cell battery, and you kept it to 90-10 in this example, because it was originally rated at 1,000 watts, or 1,000 cycles, then you could get in the same cycle life range as the Bluetti one by doing that. You could still get in the 2,000 plus cycle range, maybe for less money. The problem with that is unless you have some kind of app or something like that that can limit the discharge and limit the charge, then you'll end up having to do it manually. So let's take a look at some points of diminishing returns. So if you have your lithium this chart right here is for your 18650s. All right, so they're talking about if you want to get the absolute max. We didn't go into energy units and all that in this presentation, but they're talking about that here. So if you wanted to go into that, you're only using 10% of the battery, but you could get those 18650s way out over here in 8,000 cycle plus range. But you'd barely be using any of the battery. And so at some point there's a diminishing return. Not to mention the fact the physical age of the machine will eventually catch up to you. So about 75-20, 80-25, you can see these right here. Looking at 75-20, you're looking at the blue line here, and so you could get, say, 2,000 cycles. You're still above 90% here if you're keeping your station, your power within 75-25% of its actual capacity. Now you got to bear in mind, in the case like I've shown a minute ago, what it's saying on this, it's a scaled amount. So the actual amount, you would have to figure out what the actual battery capacity really is, because it's using a BMS which already limits the amount of power that can come out of it to be able to extend the battery life already. So you need to know what the max is, so you would know what these numbers really meant, and then compare that to what the scale is to be able to figure out what your actual capacity would be if you decided to try and use this information here to extend the battery life. All right, so let's go into our LiPo for example. So here's our EB3 I just mentioned a minute ago. You're talking about 2,500 cycle life to 80%. So that's all the way up, all the way down, all the way up, all the way down. So you're talking almost 10 years of battery life out of that before it gets to 80%. And one thing I want to note about that, about the life cycle being considered dead at 80%, is because it's not going to be another 2,500 cycles to get to 60%. Well, after it gets to 80%, it starts to fall off a lot faster. And so that's considered the usable life, even though you can continue to use it far beyond the 80%, it just will get less and less. But I wanted to make mention of that because in my previous example of the other power station, that Gano, if I did 90-10 and I got in a 2,000 cycle range, I still have 500 watt hours to play with, and this one only has 268 watt hours. So I still would have more power from that one by cycling it in that way to make it last as long as this one and still have more power than this one has. Although you would not have all the cool bells and whistles that this one has that the other one doesn't. Like powerlifting mode, it doesn't have a wireless charger and all that stuff. But just throwing it out there in case anybody does, want to take a second look at those. I know a lot of people neglect those because they want the long cycle life of lithium iron phosphate. All right, so we're going to get the 2,500 cycles. The BMS is keeping it to about 50% of depth of discharge, because remember from our chart earlier, if you just ran that lithium iron phosphate battery as hard as you could, without regard to trying to keep it safe, it would only last about 600 cycles, or about double NMC. So you get to 2,500 cycles, you're going to want to only run that to about 50%, which makes me believe that the EB3A actually has a real true watt hours of 536 watt hours. And so if we do the math on that and we wanted to try and stretch it out to 9,000 cycles, which would be an insane amount of time, then you would end up with a state of charge where you wanted to stay between 70 and 30. So you never want to go below 30, you never want to go above 70. If you could keep that, you would get an insanely long, basically unlimited battery life. 9,000 cycles would be years and years of cycling. But the downside is because you'd only get 107 watts, you'd be cycling that thing a lot faster. You'd probably cycle it several times a day if you were to be in a situation where you actually needed it. So I'm not sure how effective that would actually be. So if we wanted to go to something more realistic and say a 6,000 cycle, then you would end up with about 160 watt hours that you would be able to use, or cycling it 80-20. Unfortunately, the Blue Eddy app, it does have a nice app, but it doesn't allow you to stop the charging at say 90 and 10 or 80 and 20. It doesn't give you that option, unfortunately. So if you did an 80-10, you'd get about 3,000 cycles, which I'm figuring is about what the other, what the bigger power stations are doing, because a lot of them have 3,000, 3,500 cycle life comes with it. So that would be about the 90-10. So let's go ahead and look at the durability. So the physical durability of the actual physical plugs, if you're looking at your USB ports, you're getting about 1,500 cycles for a regular USB plug and about 10,000 cycles minimum for a USB-C. So even if you were able to extend your battery life for multiple years, you would still only be getting, you still eventually physically wear the thing out. So you kind of want to maybe time the amount of cycle life you're going to want to get to the amount of physical times you can actually use it. And wall plugs is unfortunately what I had to use for an example for the electrical outlet on there for the AC power, because there really isn't anything that I could find for the actual outlets. These were rated about 15 years, but who's unplugging and replugging them in all the time? So it's probably going to be less on a PowerStation, I imagine. But anyways, in the conclusion, there's some big advantages and disadvantages to each battery chemistry. So with some of this information, you might be able to extend the battery life in yours, and just an easy way to figure it out, just 90-10 instead of trying to go through all the math. If you stick to a 90-10 discharge charge rate, you will increase the battery life in some cases dramatically. Each chemistry's got some advantages and disadvantages. Be careful of extreme temperatures. If your PowerStation can charge at an insanely high rate and you don't need to charge it that hard, dial it back some and charge it a little slower. If you need it, it's great to have in emergencies, but if you don't need it, then slow the speed down some. But anyways, look for battery PowerStations that have a battery percentage readout, because it'll be a lot easier if you want to do this. And if you have ones that have an app that allows you to set the max charge and discharge, it's easier to get a long cycle life. Anyways, thank you and have a good night. SHTF Garden out.